everybody. I have a wonderful delivery of a guest here today, David Newell, but you may know him better as Mr. McFeely, excuse me, blowing it right here on the top. But I start all of these interviews. You can do a lot better job of telling folks about you than I can. So, David, can you tell us a bit about yourself?
My name's David Newell, and on Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, beginning in 1967, I have been playing Mr. Mcfeely, the Speedy Delivery man. And by the way, Mcfeely, the name came from Fred Rogers. His middle name is Fred McFeely Rogers. And I thought I had a job for 1 year. And should I go back and start from the beginning and let you know how I got to this point?
Well, no, that goes right into question two here. You're a Pittsburgh boy. It's kind of my adopted city. I grew up 2 hours up north, but I've been in Pittsburgh well over 15 years now. Can you tell us how you went from Pitt to the Pittsburgh Playhouse?
I decided I want to get into some form of theater. And I saw an advertisement for the Pittsburgh Playhouse School of the Theater. And it was a 2-year intensive course in acting, directing, stage management, everything. You learned everything. It was an intensive 2 years in theater. And I went through that. The summer of 1967, that was it. I decided I'm going to visit my cousin in London. And while I was there, I got a telegram from a mutual friend of Fred Rogers and mine saying that the telegram said that Mr. Rogers, Fred Rogers, is going to take the regional version of Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood and make it national. He got some underwriting from the Sears Roebuck Foundation, and my friend set up an appointment with me, with Fred Rogers, and I met him. And I didn't know him. I had met him before, and we spoke for about an hour. This was in September of '67. And at the end of an hour, he said, "When can you start?" That was his way of interviewing me. He found out a lot about me without really asking too much about my background in theater and TV and so forth. But I think he knew that I was capable of doing what he wanted. And my job was to be in charge of all of the props and costumes and getting things ready for taping. And I was the production coordinator. That's what I was being hired for. Well, and I was about ready to leave. And he said, "Oh, by the way, I've written in this series of scripts a delivery man, and I want you to play him." And I said, "Oh, I'd love to do that." And so that added to my duties, and I became Mr. McFeely / properties, costumes, production, etc. And I did all of that. And that's how I started in Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. And again, as I said before, I thought I had a job for 1 year, and here I am talking to you in 2023. And I'm still doing McFeely.
Now, I heard that Fred had just this aura when meeting him. You talked about, quickly, going through the whole process of speaking with him, and then, when can you start? Like, what was it like, meeting Fred for the first time?
As I told you earlier, I did know him, but I did know him from television, and I knew his history in Pittsburgh. He helped start public television in the United States. In 1954, his was the first children's program on then NET, National Educational Television. And that went into Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood eventually. So he had this, at least in Pittsburgh, this, as you say, aura about him. Fred, when you meet him for the first time, it's a very intense. You're with him. He's with you 100%. He doesn't. When you would walk into his office, for instance, and ask him a question about a script, he would, if you were working on something, he'd put it down and give you his undivided attention. And that shows respect for people. That was Fred. He respected people, and by giving his full attention to even a minor question, was showing respect for people. And I think that same respect came through the television set and his respect for children too. You can tell it wasn't an act. He wasn't an actor. It was the real thing. And again, as you mentioned before, when I met him, he had an aura of a mission about him. This wasn't, oh, this is a TV, we got to do this TV show. It wasn't that at all. Sitting there, look across the table from him, there was a man who had a mission, and he had these scripts that he's just written, and he wanted to invite me to be a part of that mission. And I said yes. And but I'll never forget that day that I first met him. For that entire hour before he even asked me about working, I had just come back from visiting my cousin in London, and he talked about his travels and how much he liked to travel. But he asked me questions about my travel. He asked me questions about my background, what I like to do, and we had a conversation, not an interview, and that was different. And I think that relaxed me because it was a conversation, and I think he did that on purpose. He was putting me at ease, and at the same time evaluating my aura, I guess, to be working on the neighborhood, and it worked. So here I am talking to you, Speedy Delivery.
So how long did it take to realize, what you guys were doing there was just absolutely game changing in terms of children, not just children's entertainment, but development for children? Because I don't think there's been anybody, or there's not been a show like Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood before or even since. So when did
No,
you guys?
and I don't think there can be, because I think you need Fred Rogers for that. He, an actor could do it, but he wasn't an actor. It wouldn't be the same program. You could call it somebody's neighborhood, but it wouldn't be the same because Fred Rogers was who he was. He had a background in child development, a background in theology, and a strong background in music, and all those disciplines he put into Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. And he also had a mentor whose name was Dr. Margaret McFarland from University of Pittsburgh. And she was the person who he would meet with and talk about child development topics and make sure he was doing something that would be appropriate for that age group. She was her specialty was preschoolers, but she also worked with, at University of Pittsburgh, Dr. Spock and Eric Erickson, who wrote many books on psychology and psychiatry. And all of that discipline she learned and imparted it to Fred. And Fred would meet with her every Tuesday and talk about the scripts and what he wanted to do. That was his mission. Let's take this medium that's been selling popcorn and cornflakes and try to help children and families, especially children who are preschoolers, interpret the world. I think in a way he interpreted childhood for a lot of children, and interpreted childhood for the parents too. That was his mission, to do something positive with this medium we call television. And I learned so much working with him. I feel that I have a degree in child development now, although I don't. My degree was in English literature and theater from the University of Pittsburgh. But boy, what a teacher he was. And he taught not so much by now you do this, but by example. A lot of the programs that you see, for instance, in Friendship, or you could see the exchange that he would have with people on television, the neighbors, and it was a genuine affection for that person. And he would shake hands, and it was very unique. And as you said earlier, it's unlike any children's program that's been around. The closest, in a way, I think, would be Sesame Street is a wonderful show too, but they dealt more with numbers and letters, and Fred dealt more with affective learning, feelings. But then they both, over the years, have dealt with both. So I think if you ask about two excellent children's programs, I would give you Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood and Sesame Street. They're wonderful programs. Both have their own style. The Neighborhood is much slower. Sesame is faster, but it depends on the child too. Fred always thought his pace on television, a lot of adults don't understand his pace. It's very slow and methodical, but that is the age you're dealing with, a preschooler. And that's what they need. They need that pace to absorb all of the material that he's presenting. Oh, and also the space, he called the space between the television set and the child at home. That space is holy ground. He always, and that's very unique, because he qualified that by saying that space is important because producers of children's program, especially for young children, or any producers for that matter of television, have a responsibility to do the best they can for their audience.
And how important was it having the show on PBS, and how important is public access in terms of entertainment and education for that type of medium?
You mean how important was it for our program to be on PBS?
Yeah, and just public access in general in terms of having an alternative.
I think Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood was made for public television. We didn't have to sell anything except selling feelings and emotions and care for young children. But public television gave us that opportunity to experiment, expand on what he would like to do next. He had really no regulations from public television to do this, do that. You can't do this, you can't do that on commercial television. And I can understand that. It's commercial television. You have to stop and sell cornflakes or whatever. But Fred, that would not have been comfortable for Fred to do that. He said he never wanted to make a consumer out of a child. He wanted to give important messages of concern and care to children. And that's what he did. And public television was the perfect vehicle to do that.
There's kind of a timelessness about Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. No matter what decade it was on, the show had a consistently, stayed pure to its goal and message. How much is that owed to Fred having such a steadfast set of principles on what the show was and would be?
Well, first of all, you said it has a timelessness, and I always sort of compared Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood with the timelessness of the Wizard of Oz film. You can look at Wizard of Oz, and it resonates now as it did when it was first made, 50 years ago, 60 years ago. And the Neighborhood, too, when you think of it, there are reruns of Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood that your viewers may not know. It's on pbskids.org, and they can see about 300 or 400 Mr. Rogers programs online now, as well as broadcast on weekends. So it's still here, and it still resonates.
Now, are there any particular moments that stand out from the show more than others for you from over the years, like particular tapings or backstage? Or
for me personally, yeah, well, I think my favorite segment, and I've told this to other people too, you of course know the movie Wizard of Oz. And in that movie, there's a wicked witch. And the actress's name is Margaret Hamilton. And to this day, I have adults coming up to me saying, I am so glad you did that Wizard of Oz segment with Margaret Hamilton, because as an adult, as a kid, though, I watched that movie and was traumatized by the witch, scared by the witch. And when we had Margaret Hamilton, the actress, on the program, she came and talked about her role as the Wicked Witch. And she said, that's not me. I'm pretending I'm an actress. And she came in her so-called civilian clothes, and we had a costume replica of the witch's costume, and she tried it on. See, it's a costume, and here's how I did my laugh, and she did her cackle, and this was all in Fred Rogers, the living room of the set. And it really broke down the scary images that children have, because they do have frightening images that they see almost every day, especially around Halloween. I think in one segment of the program, he said, now you could pretend that you're a witch, or you're a scary image. You can try on different hats and pretend. That way they learn that that witch, that particular witch in the movie, was only pretend. So that was one of my favorite. And Margaret Hamilton, by the way, the actress, was a lovely person. She was so different from being a witch. She's been in over 200 movies in her career, playing characters, and she became a good friend. Actually, my wife and I, would get a phone call every Sunday night from Margaret Hamilton, and it was like she was Aunt Margaret. She said, "Oh, call me Aunt Margaret," and she was so down to earth. She lived in New York City, and on Sunday night she would call. We would catch up because we made friends with her during the taping of the show.
And is it it's funny. I'm sorry that you mentioned that, because I remember that. I think it was before my time, but I remember that was such a monumental thing on the show, like seeing it, after it had aired. So it's just funny for you to mention that. Is it crazy to see different generations come up to you and tell you how much the show meant to them? Because
Oh,
I started watching it, I think I was 2 or 3 years old, and now I'm here with wrinkles. But just yeah, all the different age groups that come up to you and talk.
it happens all the time. As I mentioned earlier, I was in Florida for the Comic Con, and then I was in Chicago about 2 weeks before that for another event. And it's constant. They'll come up and say, "I grew up with you and Mr. Rogers." That's always. These are people in their 50s now. That's the first wave of kids who grew up the program. They're in their 50s, and then the 40s, and the 30-year-olds, and on down through preschoolers who are seeing it now. Programs that you probably watched when you were growing up, they're seeing them now online. But it happens a lot. And at these Comic Cons, they'll stop by and want to get a picture or an autograph, simply because they did grow up with the program, and it evoked so many memories in them. Memories of, when you're 5 and 6, you're watching television and you don't have basically a care in the world. Basically, they turn the neighborhood. That's what I've heard, that this kindness washes over them. If that's the best way I can sort of describe it to answer your question. But yes, I get a lot of people who, in fact, almost every adult says that when they get an autograph, they'll say that they grew up with the program. And then I'll find out where they grew up and how they saw the program. Some would say they would come home from school, or some would say that's when it was on 3 times a day. Some would watch it at noontime while they ate their lunch and go back to school. Some saw it in school, but it was a staple of families through these many years, and still is in many ways, except there's a lot of extra competition now from streaming and 500 other channels.
Now, for being on the show, when did you first realize that you were now a celebrity? And what is it like being a celebrity and being known as, Mr. Mcfeely, Speedy Delivery, and all that good?
Well, I guess that I'll back up a little bit. When we first realized the neighborhood was getting into homes and being very popular is when the Tonight Show, Johnny Carson did a parody of Mr. Rogers, and then Saturday Night Live did a parody, and that you could tell that something was in the culture, because you don't do parodies of something that people don't know. And but how I I I don't the other day I don't get recognized that much because I'm out of my costume. But the other day, where was this? Just happened 2 days ago. Where was I? I was in a restaurant. That's eating with some friends, and somebody said, "Excuse me, are you Mr. Mcfeely?" And I said, "Yes." And how did you know that? She said, "Well, your voice was one," and she said, "You look like Mr. McFeely." And I said, "Well, I don't have my costume on or my hat on," but she watched a lot as a child and still watched with her grandkids now. So she figured it all out. But more and more, I'm being recognized. And I think part of it is because there's a documentary that was theatrically released a couple of years ago. And I'm in that being interviewed about working with Fred. Then there's did you see the movie with Tom Hanks?
Yes.
A Beautiful Day in the Neighborhood. Well, there I have a cameo in that, and people have recognized me in that little cameo in a restaurant in the film. So there are more and more, and I'm doing more interviews like this, and people see me as David Newell and not Mr. McFeely in my costume. So, but it makes me feel good. I guess to answer your question, it makes me feel good that someone recognizes the extreme pleasure I had in working with Fred Rogers. You know, there's that saying that you've heard. It's called something like, "Oh, when you choose a career or your life's work, choose something you'll love because you'll never work a day in your life." You've heard that. It's a little corny, but it's true. I've never worked a day in my life. I've been with the program. I started in '67, and I've really never really worked a day in my life. Now that's a little facetious because you know what the point I'm trying to make is. But making television is not easy, and we did 65 half hours within a season, and that's churning them out. The television, and Fred did it at a very methodical pace too. He wanted to get things just right, so it was a lot of intensive work. But at the same time, I loved what I was doing and looked forward to going to work in the morning.
And now, after all these years, you're a cartoon character now. How does
Oh,
that
that's
feel?
right.
Yeah, you're
Yeah,
on Daniel
uh,
Tiger,
yeah,
so
Daniel
I guess
Tiger's
that's when you
Neighborhood.
made it when you're a cartoon, right?
Pardon me.
I guess that's when you know that you've absolutely made it when you're there's an animated version of you.
You're a cartoon. Yeah, I think I'm the only character from the neighborhood that spilled over into Daniel Tiger's neighborhood, except for Daniel, of course. At any rate, that's one program, Daniel Tiger's, but we have another that's taken from the neighborhood called Donkey Hody. Have you ever seen that one? Donkey's the first name, and Hody's the second. A little play on words, kids don't get it. But it is all puppets, and it is going into its second season, and they've introduced on that show, and they tape it in Chicago, and I was there because they introduced in the second season a turtle puppet whose name is Turtle Lou, but he's a Speedy Delivery turtle. He wears a Speedy Delivery uniform. He's only, he's a puppet. But I went there a couple of weeks ago to Chicago, and they interviewed me, or Turtle Lou was interviewing me along with his puppeteer, and we had a little promotion for Don Quixote's second season, and we sang the Speedy Delivery song, and they'll use it to promote the second season online of Don Quixote. So if your viewers have never seen Don Quixote, It's on public television around the country. In the Pittsburgh area, it's on WQED, and that's, by the way, where we made Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, at a station in Pittsburgh, the PBS station called WQED, the first one on the air, and Fred Rogers was responsible for getting that launched. So he is the history of public television, and I was so fortunate to be able to work with him and learn. But he also was comfortable enough with me and to let me go out and visit public stations on weekends. I would go to public stations and visit. They'd have a Meet Mr. Mcfeely day on a weekend. So I did a lot of that. I've traveled around. I've been to every state in the union now, visiting public television stations.
And so what is that like? Because I know that post the show, you kind of travel the world as Mr. Mcfeely. What is that like, getting to visit all these places and meet all these people and, just find out how the show, touched their lives and things like that?
It's wonderful because you think when you're making the show, you're doing it for four walls in a studio. There's no studio audience. It's just the other actors and the crew, and that's it. When you get out and for instance, where was I one of the first times? Oh, I think it was in New Mexico. They had me. There was a Mr. Rogers Day at the New Mexico public station, and they didn't know what to expect. It was free, come down and meet Mr. Mcfeely, and there were lines around the block, which was wonderful, and so we managed to be able to meet in groups. I would meet every one of them and shake hands and sign autographs, have pictures taken. Then I would do a little show with some of the puppets I took with me, and that group would move on, and then we'd do another group. And that was similar to what I did at other stations too. But I always wanted to meet the families individually. After we did the little show, about 20-minute show with some songs, etc., I would meet the people who wanted to stay and say hello. And I always found that so interesting to meet the parents, and somebody always would give me what they're doing and what they like about the program, and I asked them what they did, and it was so interesting.
And before I get to basically my final question there, can you tell me there's something right over your shoulder there? It looks like a red sweater.
Yes.
Mention that real quick.
Can you see that? That is Fred Rogers, one of his sweaters. I'll see if I can move it a little. There you go. And that is it's in I don't know if you can see, it's in a glass case, like a frame. And one day, Fred gave me that. He gave me two sweaters, actually. He said, you might want to have these as remembrances of our years together. And here's a sweater that and I said, oh, I'd love to have them. And I took them home, put them in our closet in our bedroom. And one birthday, about 3 years ago, our son somehow snuck out one of the sweaters, took it to a framing place, as you see, and had it mounted and gave it to me for my birthday. That was a couple of years ago. And I was so surprised. Not only does it represent my years in the neighborhood, and it represents a gift that Fred gave me, but it also, and probably the most important to me, is that my son did that for me. Because he knew my love for the program and my love for my job, and it was the perfect gift, and I was so surprised. So every time I see that image or that picture, I think of not only Fred and my years in the neighborhood, but also my son and my family. It really is symbolic of all of that, and I treasure it.
It's funny. I'm doing this interview with you right now, and I'm in Latrobe, the birthplace of Fred Rogers. And, there are statues to him here, and just how much he just meant, and Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood has meant to the world here. To kind of end things, I'm sorry, I'm a very broad question, but what do you think is the legacy of Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood and Fred's Mission?
That is a broad question. I think the legacy will be that I think and I hope that people who produce programs for young children will watch the neighborhood and learn from it. Not copy it, but learn from it, be inspired by it, see how he dealt with certain topics. And if somebody else can be inspired by what Fred did, that would be a legacy, I think. And I think Fred would really love that. It's something that he did for children on television, would inspire another television producer or maker to use it in their own way, therefore creating a legacy of Fred's work, if that makes sense. That makes sense.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I grew up as a huge fan, and I'm a filmmaker now myself, and I think, like, part of that I owe to finding out that Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood was shot just 2 hours, down south in Pittsburgh. It wasn't just somewhere far, far away, So I think that kind of hit me as a kid. But I can't thank you and everybody involved in the production, and obviously Fred for helping me grow up. I loved that show so much. I love Mr. Mcfeely. I always liked when you came on, and so yeah, I can't thank you enough for all the years and memories and helping whatever's good about me. But I owe a lot of that to you guys over at Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. So David, thank you so much. I can't tell you how much this means to me.
Well, thank you, John. And if you ever want to do a part 2, just let me know. But just remind everybody that they can still see Mr. Rogers, pbskids.org. And they can see about 300 on there of shows that are the classics. So we're still in the neighborhood, and I'm still making deliveries too. So someday we might meet in person. And I'm going to count to 3, and we'll end this way. A count to 3, and we'll both say Speedy Delivery, okay? Here we go. 1, 2, 3.
Speedy Delivery.
Thanks, John. Speedy Delivery to you. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you.
You're welcome.